In the last video, we started our journey into version control by talking about, at a high level, what version control is and what are the concepts that are involved. So we're going to be, in this video, diving into actually using Git, github.com, and GitHub Desktop to set up a repository. So that would be a project that's under version control. Make a few commits to it. So doing this process of taking snapshots at different versions and pushing all of that to our remote repository on github.com so that we both have a local history on our machine and we have a history that is accessible from github.com, which means that other folks could collaborate with us, or we could just use it as a way to back up our code and have the history stored outside of our computer. So for this process, make sure that you have a GitHub account. Make sure that you have GitHub Desktop installed, or if you're using you're following along with another GUI, that's fine. Make sure you've got that accessible. And make sure you have your terminal and Git bash set up if you're on Windows, and make sure that you have Git installed if you're on a Mac. See the previous videos links for that info. What we're going to do is jump into GitHub Desktop. So GitHub Desktop, when you open it up, will prompt you to log in for the first time. Once you've logged in, you will have this toolbar at the top that allows you to create a new repository. Once you have a few repositories, you'll see something more like what I have here, where you can see all the repositories that are currently set up through GitHub Desktop on your machine. So I'm going to go File, New Repository, and I'm going to name this HTML Git Demo, a demo of using HTML, CSS, JavaScript with Git and GitHub. So this name is going to be where things are stored under our GitHub account eventually. And this is the description that'll be associated with it. This local path is where do you want to store this on your computer. So you could store it anywhere. It doesn't have to be in this default GitHub directory, but that is where I tend to keep most of my repositories. I'm going to make sure to initialize this with a README, which will put a mostly blank README markdown file in my project. And then for now, I'm going to leave the git ignore set to none and the license set to none. Git ignore allows you to configure how some files get excluded from your repository, which we'll talk more about that later. And license is about which open source license do you want to put this project under. So once you've filled this out, hit create repository. GitHub Desktop is creating a folder there on your machine with your README in it. And you can see that there's some info here about this has not been pushed to GitHub. Make sure that you publish to GitHub. You can open your repository in an external editor. I like to use up here this repository dropdown. There's a show in Explorer on Windows. This will probably say show in Finder on a Mac, which will pop this directory open on your machine. So you can see mine stored on GitHub in HTML-git-demo folder. And since I have my file explorer set up to show me hidden files and folders, I can see this hidden folder .git, which has all of the information stored in it for how this repository should be set up. So you want to make sure you don't delete that file accidentally as you're working on this project. It also comes with a Git attributes file. We won't worry about that just yet. And then there's also this README file that is mostly blank. So you can use the repository view show in Explorer to get to your project. You can also configure this with your chosen external editor. I have mine set up so that I have an open in Visual Code option here, which will pop this folder open in Visual Studio Code. I can see my README, where the title is here and the description has been inserted, and I've got that Git attributes file as well. So not a ton in here just yet. let's leave this open, but we'll flip back to GitHub Desktop. So also under this repository, there is an option for opening your project in a terminal window. So my settings for GitHub Desktop are configured to open in Git Bash. So when I do that, I will be in my HTML Git demo folder. And if I do ls, like we learned before, I'll see my README in there. If we go into this option again, we can see the view on GitHub option is grayed out because we created a repository locally, but we didn't actually publish it to GitHub. So what I'm going to do is hit the publish button here or here to publish this to github.com. For repositories in this class, you want to make sure that this is unchecked. That way you can share your code with peers in your class, and you can also share it with me. So it's the name and description are being auto-filled from what we set up on our machine. Those are fine. And then we can hit publish, which if we're all logged in and authenticated, what this is doing is taking our local history, here, and syncing it with GitHub, creating a project there that has the same history. And if we look at our history, there's not a lot there. There's just an initial commit that has these things that were generated by GitHub Desktop for us. But once we do that publish, we should be able to click on repository, view on GitHub, which will take us to the GitHub page for our project. So here we can see the same thing. Here's the Git attributes, here's the README. If I click on the README, click on raw, we can see what we were seeing on our machine. If I go back, we can also click here on the commit to see the history in the same way that we can see it here. So we can see that there's one commit in the remote history, and there's one commit in my local history. So they're completely synced at this point. We made this repository public, so anyone could check this out. If we go back to the main page for our repository, there's this green download button, which allows you to open up this in GitHub Desktop or download a zip of this repository. So anyone could come and clone this, contribute something, and then open up what's called a pull request to send you those contributions. Okay, so this first step that we did where we created a repository, published it to GitHub, that's our initialization step. Once we have this set up, we don't have to do that again for this repository. We can just work with what we've got in GitHub Desktop and in Visual Studio here to work on our project and push changes to github.com. So the workflow that we're going to go through now is we're going to make a change, we are going to commit it, and then we're going to push it. And we're going to repeat that process every time we want to make a change to our project here. So if we look back at our diagram, every time we sit down to work, we are going to work in our working directory. That's just the contents of your project folder. When we're ready, we're going to do this process of staging and committing, where we select which files we want to commit, put them into a snapshot. That will be on our local computer, and then when we hit push, that will take our local history and sync it with the remote history on github.com. What we're going to do here is in Visual Studio, we are just going to make a simple website. So we're going to add HTML file, and we're going to add some CSS and some JavaScript and commit as we go. So for all of these, when you're making your commits, we're striving for atomic commits. So really small commits that are about one feature at a time. And when we make a commit, we kind of want to leave the repository in a working state. So what I want to do is create a index.html file, and I'm going to use Emmet in Visual Studio to just expand this and give us our HTML template. And if I save this to let Prettier kick in, this is enough to create our first commit. So this is something that is working. If I were to right click and open in Chrome, we have a blank browser. We can also use Live Server, which we installed previously, to open this HTML project in the browser and see it running. There's nothing on the page, but it is a valid page. So let's come back to GitHub Desktop. And now that we have changed something in our working directory, we can see that GitHub Desktop is detecting that we have changes that we could commit. And when we're in this mode, we can check whole files, or we can actually line pick specific sections of files to commit. In this case, it makes sense to just commit this whole index.html file. And what we want to do for each commit is create a descriptive commit message. So for this, we might say that we added HTML skeleton for homepage. And if the thing that you are typing in here for your message is a long thing that requires extended description, you can use the description box. So you try to keep this trim, and the description box is for any other information. So if I wanted to add an extra note that this skeleton comes from the latest version of Emmet in VS Code. After I have staged, clicked on the files that I want to include and written my message, I can make a snapshot from that by clicking commit to main. So what that does, if I flip over to my history, is add a new snapshot in the history that has our description, has our title, our description, and then has the files that have been changed listed here. And the ones that have changes that have been added are going to be marked with a plus in green. And when we get to removing things, those will be added with a red minus sign to indicate that things have been removed. You will also see that we have a hash here. So if we go back to our whiteboard, we said that each commit is going to have a SHA hash that uniquely identifies that commit. Now we have a new one, and that's automatically added to generated for us and added here by Git. So we can see we have a different one here for the initial commit. So right now, if I were to go check out my repository on github.com and refresh the page, there is still only one commit here, even though I have 2 commits on my local machine. This commit that we just made needs to actively be pushed to github.com, to our remote server, to actually get it there. So this, if we think about our process, we have changed something in our working directory, we have staged, so we selected that we wanted to add index.html, and committed that, made a snapshot, but that history is just on our local machine. We need to push it to get it to the remote. So this button up here will take any of your history that has not been synced and try pushing it up. So it'll take a second. When that finishes, though, I can come back to my repository on github.com, refresh, and we should now see 2 commits, and our index.html file is in here now. So that's the process. We make some changes, stage those changes, commit those changes, and then push them to get them onto the remote github.com servers. So let's just practice that process a couple more times. Right now, this application, this website is pretty boring. It's just a blank page. So maybe we want to change the title and we want to add a header. So if we think about that process, that idea of atomic commits where we want to make really small features and commit them, I'm going to work on those separately. So maybe the first thing I do is come into the body here and create an H1 that says my site. And now it shows up here. So once I've finished that feature, this is admittedly a really simple feature, but this shows you the idea. I can come back into GitHub and I can then select either whole files or specific lines. In this case, I want to select this whole file. I want to remove what I had before, the body, and add the body with an H1. And then I can say added welcome message to homepage. And it's really important that these commit messages, you think about making them descriptive, because it makes it for a much more readable history than if every time you make a commit, you just type some random letters. So here I'm going to say I added a welcome message, commit, check out my history. That's now in here. But remember, this hasn't been pushed to github.com, so I'm going to make sure that I push that. And then once I do that process, I should see that commit show up here. Here was my commit from 15 seconds ago, added a welcome message. And if I click on index.html, we can see that H1 in there. Okay, so that's our H1. Let's change the title of our document here to be Git demo. Give it a save. Check it out on the browser. It says Git demo, so feature is working. Let's commit and push it. So we'll come back in here. We'll make sure that we have this selected, and you can see we removed this line and replaced it with this line. So we can say changed homepage title to Git demo. And then push it to make sure that it's live on github.com. And there it is. Okay, so this process, making small changes, committing, and repeating, is great, but sometimes you will forget to do that. And so I want to demo that process. Let's say we're working on this application. In this case, it's a really simple website, but we want to make it a dark theme website. So we want to flip the color scheme here. And we were also working on adding some JavaScript into it. So maybe what we do is let's get a main.js file in here that will just print out an alert box. And we will link that in here. So I'm going to use emit expansion to get our script with the source pointing to main.js. And we will make this a module. So now our site should pop up a hello box when it loads. And let's say we continued to work on things and we added a style.css file that took the body and flipped the background color to be black and the color to be white. So this CSS file has been created, and then we can link it in here using emit expansions again, link CSS, and pass in the hypertext reference of, whoops, not that, style.css. There we go. So we created a script, linked it in here, and we created some CSS and linked it in here. If I flip back to my page and refresh it, I got my alert box and I have my dark mode of my website created. So that's great. We got the features done, and then we flip back to GitHub Desktop and we're like, oh shoot, we actually changed a bunch of files, and we really, if we wanted to do this in a nicely organized way, maybe we should have made one change, come back to GitHub Desktop, committed it, and then worked on the next change. But you can also use the line picking here to kind of isolate your features. So here I can click on main.js to get this added to my stage. And then if I go to index.html to actually link that main.js, all I have to do is click on this single line that brought in our script tag. So this file and that single line are the script feature. That's our JavaScript feature. So once I've got those staged, I can go ahead and add a description here to say like added welcome alert via JavaScript to the main page. And when that commit has been made, now I can see that the changes in my current directory, in my working directory, are the style and just the link. So now I could select this and select my index.html and say added dark mode to the home page via CSS and commit that. And if I look back at my history, I can see here is my commit, my snapshot that just had the JavaScript change that we made. And here's the snapshot that just had that CSS change. And again, push it. So now both of these commits will be sent to github.com. And we should see this go from 4 to 6 commits. And now we have our main.js and our style.css here. So we're striving for this idea of atomic commits, small commits that are individual features that we get into our history here. The reason why we do that is there are multiple reasons. One is that it gives us more quote unquote save points for our code. When each thing is a small feature, we can look through the history and we could fly back in time to any specific feature. So the more commits we have, the more options we have for going back through our history. It also makes it a lot easier to collaborate because we have changed fewer files in this commit. That means that when we start collaborating with others, there's less of a chance for us to run into conflicts where we changed the same files. And also, when we do this atomic commit, the history, these messages and the changes are really easy to read. If we had combined both of these into one commit, we would have had 3 files changing, some JavaScript changing, some CSS changing, some HTML changing, and it would be hard for someone to parse at a glance what's going on. I'm going to add a little caveat here that this is what we're striving for. This line picking process won't always be possible. Sometimes you won't be able to disentangle all of the changes you made by doing this line picking, and that's okay. We're trying to do this atomic commit, but it's okay that sometimes we're not able to hit that level of modular committing. What I think folks tend to find is that when you're setting up a project for the first time, you have some bigger scale commits of like creating a whole bunch of pages, creating the initial styling, and then when the project stabilizes and you've got a fair chunk of it built, the commits become smaller and more atomic. So far, so good. We have been able to make commits on our own. We made them nice and modular. The complication with Git comes in when you bring in someone else to collaborate with you on your code. So if I were working with someone else and we were both trying to make commits that changed the HTML file, we would run into a situation where maybe we both made commits simultaneously, tried to merge them together, and then we have to deal with how do you actually merge something when 2 people change the same file at the same time. So we're going to simulate this so that you can go through the process of having a conflict and resolving it. So if we go back to our browser here, if we edit something in the browser, that is going to kind of simulate what it would be like for someone to modify the history of the project while we're working on it. So let's say that someone comes into our HTML file here and they edit it on their machine. And what they did was add a header at the top that said homepage. And for the commit message, I'm going to say, this is just for us that we're faking a commit from a teammate, added homepage header, and then committed. So now the history on our remote has changed. So the history on github.com servers of the project is different than our local. So we have 7 commits here. And if we flip back to GitHub Desktop, we only have 6 commits here. We don't have that change in our repository until we actually pull it down. So let's pretend that we didn't know that our teammate pushed that. We didn't know that we should pull it down, and we were working simultaneously here. So we don't have our header in our local working directory, but we go ahead and we create a paragraph that says this is our demo Git site. And we save this, and then we come back to GitHub Desktop and we commit our change and say added explanation paragraph to homepage, hit commit, and saw that in our history, we now have this one that needs to be pushed. So we have something new. We have 7 commits with 1 new one on our machine, and on our repository on our remote setup on our github.com servers here, there are 7 commits with one that's different. So we have diverging histories, and we need to somehow rectify that. If we come back to our GitHub Desktop project here, if I click this push origin, it's going to actually try to check if there have been any changes to the remote server before pushing our changes. So if I click this, it's telling me that we're unable to push to that remote because there are commits on the remote that we don't have on our local branch, on our local machine here. So it's telling us you have to fetch before you're able to actually push. So we're going to click fetch. And now this icon has changed. It's telling us that there's 1 new commit for us to push up and 1 new commit for us to pull down. So now let's click this. And what has happened is that there is our commit here with our paragraph, and there is a new commit that has been automatically generated by GitHub or by Git for us here. That is a merge commit. Basically, it has taken what it found online, this edition of the homepage, and created a commit on our machine to merge the remote state with our current state on our local machine. So now, once we've got that set up, we've dealt with this merge, we can hit push, and we're going to now send 2 commits. We're sending our new edition and then our commit that reconciles our local history with the github.com servers. So when I refresh this, we should actually jump to 9 commits because of those 2 that were just pushed. 9 commits, and we can see there's the added homepage, here's our explanation, and then here's our merge that rectifies the history and gets everything back in sync. You may be thinking, oh, that wasn't too bad. That was actually a pretty easy change for us to sync across 2 machines. And the reason why is because we edited 2 different lines in the same file. That's great. That's easy to automatically resolve. There are other ways to resolve that. Like in future videos, I would recommend rebasing rather than doing what we did, but like that merge conflict got us back in sync and got our commits live on github.com. So it was fine. The more complex situation that comes in is when we try to modify the same line as a teammate does. So let's simulate that same thing. So maybe what we're going to do is, let's say that our teammate comes in again and is on the index.html file and looking at the header and saying, well, it's weird that it says homepage. Well, it should probably just say home. And they make a commit. Let's put a little fake team member descriptor in here again. Removed. Unnecessary word page from header. They commit that, they make that change. This is live on the github.com history of our project where it just says home. But again, it's not live on our local version. We'd actually have to actively pull things down before working to get those changes. But we're pretending that we're working simultaneously to our teammate. So maybe when I was working on it coming through, I was like, well, this is fine, but I actually want like a little home emoji to show up here next to the word home. And that's the change that I was making. And we can see here's my change currently on our local copy. And we go back to GitHub desktop here, and we happily go ahead and commit this. Added emoji to the header on the home page. Great. We have our history. Again, github.com. There is the divergent history on our remote on our server. So when I go to push complaints, you got to do a fetch before you can actually make a push, because there's a different history on github.com. So I'm going to hit fetch. We're back at the situation where GitHub desktop is telling us there's something to push and there's something to pull. So we're going to have to resolve this conflict. But when I hit this button, it's new. It's GitHub desktop is telling us that it could not automatically resolve the conflicts. So there is something that requires human intervention. And because I have my GitHub desktop configured to use Visual Studio Code, it gives me this prompt that I can click on to open in Visual Studio Code. I've already got this open, so I'm just going to flip back. Here's our structure for a conflict. It is maybe jarring the first time you see it, but really what it's telling you is that this spot in our file has two different versions. We have what is on our machine in our most recent commit, which is head here. Here's what we added. We added an emoji to homepage. And here it's telling us this commit, this hash, tried to put this in the same spot in the file, header home. So it's giving us all the information we need to resolve this conflict. Here's what I found in one place. Here's what I found in another place. Now please fix it. And if you're working in VS Code, there is this menu that pops up when VS Code detects this special Git syntax that shows you the conflict. So accept current change, if I click that, is going to get rid of the conflict and just take my change locally from my machine. If I say accept incoming change, that is going to just accept this commit from github.com from our fake teammate. If I click on accept both changes, that's going to keep both lines of code in this file. And I can just go in and delete this syntax myself, and now Git no longer knows or no longer recognizes that there's a conflict here. So as long as that syntax is removed, this over here, when I save, I forgot to save this file, so let me save this. GitHub desktop now recognizes that there's none of that commit conflict or that merge conflict syntax coming in here, so it's okay to go ahead and commit those changes. But this isn't what we want, right? So what I would do is I would either manually delete this syntax or say I'm going to accept both changes, and then I'm just going to visually compare them and try and figure out what's the best thing. So I like the change that my teammate made, so I'm going to replicate that here, and then I'm going to get rid of the double header and then save this file. And if I flip back here, now that those conflicts have been resolved, and keep in mind that there may be many conflicts, you may have multiple files that have that syntax that you have to go through and resolve, especially when you're working on a big project with multiple people. But as soon as you resolve all of those, you'll be able to come back here, click on commit merge, and we're going to get another message here that is a merge commit. So this is the change that we just made. We came in and rectified the history to get our changes from our local machine here, where we added the emoji, and the changes from the remote machine merged together. So I now can then push both of these, and my commit plus my merge commit will end up on GitHub desktop here. So I can now see 12 commits. And if I go into the index, I can see here is that header with the emoji and home. And if I refresh my page here, we can see there is the latest change brought in and synced. Okay, so we've gone through this process a couple of times where we've taken the contents that we've changed in our working directory, staged them, committed them, and pushed. And we've done the reverse, where we've actually pulled from the remote down to our local machine and handled merge conflicts, which are things that you will definitely encounter as you're working in teams in this class. The workflow that you want to go through for working on a team in Git and GitHub is that when you sit down to work, you pull the latest changes, you work on whatever you're working on, and then you commit and push before you leave your station, before you stop working. So if I were to simulate that, what I would do, let's pretend that that teammate came in again and they changed my to our. Fake teammate again here. Changed my to our in the title. Committed it, so that's here, that's been changed. What I would do when I'm going to sit down to work is actually go to GitHub desktop, and before I start working, my working directory is clean, I haven't made any changes, I left everything in a good committed state, then I will click fetch, which will tell me that there's something to bring down. I will pull origin to bring that change into my local machine. We can see the commit here. We can also see it in Visual Studio Code now. And then I could, now that I have pulled, work on my feature of adding a footer here. And maybe I add a copyright 2021. And once I've done that, I can make my change. Added footer to main page, commit, and push. It's not always possible to avoid those merge conflicts, but if you do this process where when you sit down to work, you fetch, you do your work, you make your changes, you commit them, you push them, you will reduce the number of merge conflicts that you end up with. And just to button this video, GitHub Desktop is not the only graphical user interface for interacting with Git. Actually, in Visual Studio Code, there is a built-in version control tab here where you can actually, if I put in my name here and save it, you can see your changes over here. It'll show you the difference. It will allow you to stage by clicking plus. You can even right-click and stage selected lines and type in your commit message here. And you can look through your commit history down here. And if I click on things, it'll allow me to see the changes that have been made. So I'm just going through the history of different commits. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Like if I go to our first commit, it's showing me we added our HTML. So you can see the history here, you can work on branches, you can do all sorts of things from Visual Studio Code. If you're more comfortable doing that in this class, you are more than welcome to do it. The things that you're doing in GitHub Desktop, you can do from this interface in Visual Studio Code. And there are also other clients like Git Kraken, which is my graphical user interface of choice when I'm working on projects. It looks a bit different, but I can easily open up a project from my machine here. If I just go to where I saved this, what did we call it? There we go. HTML Git demo. I can see here a similar interface. I've got my history. If I click on any of these, it's showing me over on the right-hand side the description, the files changed. If I click on this, it'll show me my diff here to show me the difference in those files. If I click up here, I can see any unstaged changes like my footer. I can stage them. I can type in my commit, added name to footer, and then commit my changes, and then push those changes to GitHub. So now it's pushed. I should see these changes reflected both in GitHub Desktop because I've modified the repository. These are both pointing to the same repository on my machine. They're just different graphical user interfaces. And because I pushed, I should see all of those changes live here. So the latest commit is added name to footer. So you can use whichever client you're more comfortable with. I personally really like Kraken. Git Kraken, it provides a lot of features, but I find that for teaching folks, GitHub Desktop is one of the easiest places to start. And you also have that option of doing this from Visual Studio Code. So that's the basics, or those are the basics of working with Git, our version control software, GitHub Desktop, our user interface, and github.com, our remote server. That's the process for working on all of these inside of a repository, inside of a project that we are putting into version control. In the future, we will dig deeper into Git and see what it is like to actually open up our terminal and use the command line interface as opposed to a GUI, and we'll learn about all the sort of fun quirks of trying to get a React project into our Git version control.